The afternoon of April 23, 1966, was warm and humid in Harlem, with temperatures reaching 78 degrees and bright sunshine illuminating the sidewalks and storefronts along Lenox Avenue. By 2:30 in the afternoon, the streets were crowded with Saturday shoppers, families walking together, and children playing near building entrances, while their parents conducted errands at neighborhood stores. Mayme Johnson was 52 years old, someone who had been married to Bumpy Johnson for nearly 18 years, and who had developed her own identity and reputation in Harlem during that time. Mayme was known as an elegant, educated woman who participated actively in community affairs through St. Martin's Episcopal Church, where she volunteered regularly and organized charitable activities. Mayme carried herself with dignity and was respected by Harlem residents for her grace and her commitment to helping others. On the afternoon of April 23rd, Mayme was walking along Lenox Avenue after leaving a church meeting where she had been planning a summer program for neighborhood children. Mayme was wearing a light blue dress appropriate for the warm weather and was carrying a handbag containing the meeting notes and her personal items. Mayme was walking north on Lenox Avenue toward 145th Street, planning to stop at a grocery store before returning home. At approximately 2:45, as Mayme was walking past a row of storefronts near 140th Street, a police car pulled to the curb beside her. Two police officers were in the car, both white men wearing the standard uniform of the New York Police Department. The officer in the passenger seat rolled down his window and called out to Mayme, addressing her as "Lady" and asking her to approach the vehicle. Mayme stopped walking and turned toward the police car, uncertain why the officers were calling to her, but conditioned by years of living in a society where black people were expected to comply immediately with police instructions, regardless of whether those instructions were justified. Mayme walked the few steps to the police car and asked politely how she could help the officers. The officer in the passenger seat was approximately 35 years old, with a thick build and reddish hair visible beneath his police cap. This officer, whose name was Thomas Sullivan, stated that there had been reports of shoplifting in the area and that Mayme matched the description of a suspect. Sullivan asked Mayme to show him what was in her handbag. Mayme felt confusion and indignation at being accused of shoplifting when she had done nothing wrong, but she also understood the danger of refusing a police officer's request. Mayme opened her handbag and held it so Sullivan could see the contents: her wallet, the meeting notes from church, a small Bible, and personal items including a compact mirror and lipstick. Sullivan looked into the bag and then stated that he needed to search it more thoroughly to ensure Mayme was not hiding stolen merchandise. Mayme handed the handbag to Sullivan, who began removing items and examining them. As Sullivan handled Mayme's personal belongings, he made comments about the quality of her wallet and her clothing, suggesting that these items were expensive and questioning how someone like Mayme could afford such things through legitimate means. The implication was clear. Sullivan was suggesting that Mayme must have acquired her possessions through theft or through involvement in her husband's criminal activities. Mayme stood on the sidewalk feeling humiliation as Sullivan continued examining her belongings while making degrading comments. Several people walking past on Lenox Avenue slowed their pace to observe the interaction, and Mayme felt the weight of public scrutiny as neighbors and strangers witnessed her being treated as a criminal suspect, despite having done nothing to warrant such treatment. After several minutes of searching through Mayme's handbag and finding nothing suspicious, O'Sullivan stated that he needed to conduct a pat-down search to ensure Mayme was not concealing stolen items in her clothing. This statement represented a significant escalation because pat-down searches of women by male officers were highly irregular and were generally conducted only under circumstances involving serious crimes or immediate safety concerns. The suggestion that Sullivan would physically search Mayme for shoplifting was both unusual and inappropriate. Mayme stated quietly that she had done nothing wrong and that such a search was not necessary. Sullivan responded by stating that refusing a lawful police search would be considered obstruction and could result in Mayme being arrested and taken to the precinct. Sullivan's tone made clear that he expected compliance and that resistance would result in consequences that would be far more humiliating than submitting to the search. Mayme understood that she had no practical recourse in this moment. She could refuse and be arrested, which would result in her being handcuffed on a public street and taken to a police station where she would likely face additional mistreatment. Or she could submit to the search and endure the humiliation with the hope that the officers would then allow her to continue on her way. Both options were degrading, but one carried the risk of escalating into something worse. Mayme stood silently on the sidewalk as Sullivan exited the police car and approached her. Sullivan instructed Mayme to place her hands on the side of the police car and to stand with her feet apart. Mayme complied, feeling acute awareness of the people watching this scene unfold. Sullivan then conducted a pat-down search that was far more intrusive and prolonged than any legitimate search for concealed merchandise would require. Sullivan's hands moved slowly and deliberately across Mayme's body, lingering in areas that had no connection to searching for stolen items. Sullivan made comments during the search about Mayme's appearance and her figure, statements that made clear the search was not about law enforcement, but about exercising power and inflicting degradation. The other officer remained in the driver's seat of the police car and said nothing, neither participating in the harassment nor intervening to stop it. The search lasted approximately 3 minutes, during which Mayme stood motionless with her hands on the police car, maintaining her composure through force of will while Sullivan violated her dignity in front of witnesses who could do nothing to help without risking their own confrontation with police authority. When Sullivan finally stepped back and stated that Mayme was free to go, Mayme collected her belongings from the hood of the police car where Sullivan had placed them, returned them to her handbag, and walked away without speaking. Mayme continued walking north on Lenox Avenue toward her original destination, but she no longer had any interest in shopping or in completing her errands. Mayme felt anger, humiliation, and violation, emotions that competed with her training to maintain composure and dignity regardless of circumstances. Mayme walked 4 blocks to her apartment and entered her home, closing the door behind her and finally allowing herself to feel the full weight of what had just occurred. Bumpy Johnson was not at home when Mayme arrived. Bumpy was 60 years old at this time, someone who had recently returned to Harlem after serving more than a decade in federal prison and who was working to maintain control of various operations while managing health problems that would ultimately lead to his death 2 years later. Bumpy typically spent afternoons conducting business at various locations throughout Harlem, returning home in the early evening. When Bumpy arrived home at approximately 6:30 that evening, he immediately recognized that something was wrong. Mayme was sitting in their living room, still wearing the blue dress she had worn that afternoon, but appearing distressed in ways that Bumpy had rarely seen during their 18 years of marriage. Bumpy asked what had happened, and Mayme explained the incident with Sullivan in careful detail, describing the accusations of shoplifting, the search of her handbag, and the prolonged, inappropriate pat-down search conducted on a public street in front of witnesses. Bumpy listened to Mamie's account without visible reaction, but those who knew him well understood that such stillness indicated intense focus and calculation. Bumpy asked specific questions about the timing of the incident, the location where it occurred, descriptions of the two officers, the patrol car's number if Mayme had noticed it, and whether Mayme could identify other witnesses who had been present on Lenox Avenue at the time. Mayme answered Bumpy's questions as thoroughly as possible, providing details about Sullivan's appearance, the approximate time of the incident, and several people she had recognized among those who had witnessed the harassment. Bumpy thanked Mayme for explaining what had happened and stated that he would address the situation in a way that would ensure such treatment would not occur again. Mayme understood that Bumpy's statement could be interpreted in multiple ways. The obvious interpretation, and the one that might occur to people unfamiliar with how Bumpy actually operated, was that Bumpy would retaliate violently against Sullivan. But Mayme knew her husband well enough to recognize that Bumpy's approach to serious problems involved strategic thinking rather than immediate emotional reactions. Bumpy had learned through decades of experience that violence was often the least effective solution to complex problems, particularly problems involving law enforcement, where violent responses could trigger escalating consequences that damaged entire communities. Bumpy spent the remainder of the evening thinking through the incident and what it represented. The immediate problem was that Sullivan had violated Mayme's dignity and had committed what amounted to sexual assault under color of law, using his authority as a police officer to inflict degradation that would have resulted in criminal charges if committed by someone without a badge. But the broader problem was that Sullivan's behavior represented a pattern of police abuse that affected the entire Harlem community, where officers routinely harassed black residents with impunity because they understood that formal complaint mechanisms were ineffective and that victims had no practical recourse. Bumpy recognized that responding to Sullivan's misconduct required addressing both the individual officer and the systemic conditions that enabled such behavior. Punishing Sullivan alone, whether through violence or through formal complaints, would accomplish little if the underlying power dynamics remained unchanged. Other officers would continue harassing Harlem residents because the structures that protected abusive cops and punished people who challenged police authority would persist. Or what was needed was a response that would accomplish multiple objectives simultaneously. Ensure Sullivan faced meaningful consequences for his actions. Create deterrent effects that would make other officers think carefully before harassing Harlem residents. Establish mechanisms that would give the community actual recourse when police misconduct occurred, and shift the power dynamics so that officers understood they could not abuse Harlem residents without triggering responses that would damage their careers and reputations. Bumpy spent April 24th developing a comprehensive strategy. Bumpy enlisted 9 trusted associates, including Marcus Henderson, Samuel Foster, Thomas Chen, Eleanor Washington, William Morrison, David Richardson, Patricia Henderson, Raymond Carter, and Dorothy Chen. Each person received specific responsibilities that would operate simultaneously to gather information and build the foundation for sustained pressure. Henderson would investigate Sullivan's background, career history, and reputation within the police department. Foster would document the incident by locating and interviewing witnesses who had seen Sullivan harass Mayme. Chen would research Sullivan's patrol patterns and previous assignments to determine whether other Harlem residents had been subjected to similar treatment. Washington would coordinate with community organizations and church leaders to build support for addressing police misconduct. Morrison would identify contacts within the police department who might be willing to provide information about Sullivan, or who might be sympathetic to complaints about his behavior. Richardson would research formal complaint procedures and legal options for addressing police misconduct. Patricia Henderson would speak with women in Harlem who might have experienced harassment by Sullivan or other officers, but who had not reported such incidents. Carter would prepare documentation of the incident that could be used in formal complaints or legal proceedings. Dorothy Chen would coordinate communication among all team members and compile information as it was gathered. These assignments began operating on April 24th and continued through the following week. Henderson's investigation into Sullivan's background revealed significant information. Sullivan had been with the New York Police Department for 11 years and had worked in Harlem for the past 6 years. Sullivan had been the subject of multiple citizen complaints during his career, though none had resulted in disciplinary action. The complaints included allegations of excessive force, false arrests, theft of money during searches, and inappropriate behavior toward women. The pattern suggested Sullivan routinely abused his authority and that the department's internal affairs processes had failed to hold him accountable. Foster's interviews with witnesses produced detailed accounts of the incident. At least 7 people had observed Sullivan harass Mayme on Lenox Avenue, and several were willing to provide written statements describing what they had seen. The witness accounts corroborated Mayme's description of the incident and included observations about Sullivan's demeanor and the inappropriate nature of the pat-down search he had conducted. Chen's research into Sullivan's patrol patterns identified at least 12 other incidents where Sullivan had stopped black women in Harlem for alleged shoplifting or other minor offenses and had conducted searches that witnesses described as inappropriate and prolonged. None of these incidents had resulted in arrests or in the recovery of any stolen merchandise, suggesting Sullivan was using minor accusations as pretexts for harassment rather than conducting legitimate law enforcement activities. Washington's coordination with community organizations revealed widespread frustration with police misconduct in Harlem and strong support for efforts to hold abusive officers accountable. Church leaders, business owners, and community activists all expressed willingness to participate in organized efforts to address the problem, recognizing that Sullivan's harassment of Mayme represented a pattern that affected many Harlem residents. Morrison's contacts within the police department provided valuable intelligence. Several officers who worked with Sullivan confirmed that he had a reputation for mistreating black residents and that other officers had witnessed his misconduct but had not reported it because police culture discouraged officers from informing on colleagues. Morrison learned that Sullivan worked out of the 28th Precinct and that the precinct's commanding officer, Captain Robert Walsh, had received previous complaints about Sullivan but had taken no action beyond verbal counseling. Richardson's research identified multiple avenues for filing complaints: internal departmental complaints through the precinct's commanding officer, complaints to the Civilian Complaint Review Board, complaints to the mayor's office, and potential civil litigation for violation of civil rights. Each avenue had limitations, but using multiple channels simultaneously could create pressure that would be difficult for the department to ignore. Patricia Henderson's conversations with women in Harlem revealed disturbing patterns. At least 20 women reported being stopped by Sullivan or other officers on questionable pretexts and subjected to searches that felt more like harassment than law enforcement. Most had not filed formal complaints because they believed such complaints would be ignored, or because they feared retaliation. The consistency of these accounts demonstrated that Sullivan's harassment of Mayme was not an isolated incident, but rather represented his standard operating procedure. Carter prepared comprehensive documentation, including witness statements, a timeline of the April 23rd incident, summaries of Sullivan's previous complaints, accounts from other women who had been harassed, an analysis of departmental policies regarding searches and interactions with civilians. This documentation created a record that could support formal complaints and that demonstrated a pattern of misconduct rather than a single questionable incident. By May 1st, approximately 1 week after the incident, Bumpy had assembled a complete intelligence picture and was ready to implement a multi-pronged strategy. The strategy involved simultaneous pressure through multiple channels designed to make maintaining Sullivan's employment untenable for the police department, while also creating structural changes that would reduce future misconduct. The first component was filing formal complaints through every available channel. Richardson prepared complaints for submission to the precinct commanding officer, the Civilian Complaint Review Board, the mayor's office, and the police commissioner's office. Each complaint included the detailed documentation Carter had prepared, demonstrating not just the April 23rd incident, but a pattern of misconduct spanning years. The complaints were filed on May 2nd, initiating formal processes that would require departmental responses. The second component was political pressure through elected officials and community leaders. Washington coordinated with Congressman Adam Clayton Powell, Jr., who represented Harlem in the U.S. House of Representatives and who had significant influence in New York City politics. Powell agreed to write to the police commissioner expressing concern about police misconduct in Harlem and specifically referencing Sullivan's harassment of constituents. Washington also coordinated with city council members, state assembly representatives, and local ministers who contacted the mayor's office and police department leadership expressing concern about the pattern of abuse documented in the complaints. The third component was community organizing, to demonstrate that Sullivan's misconduct affected many people rather than just one prominent family. Washington and Patricia Henderson organized a meeting at St. Martin's Episcopal Church where women who had been harassed by police officers could share their experiences. More than 40 women attended the meeting on May 5th, and 23 provided written accounts of inappropriate searches, sexual harassment, or other misconduct by Sullivan or other officers. This meeting generated newspaper coverage in the Amsterdam News, Harlem's leading African-American newspaper, on which published an article about police harassment of black women that included details about Sullivan's pattern of misconduct. The fourth component was creating pressure within the police department itself through officers who were troubled by Sullivan's behavior or who understood that protecting abusive colleagues damaged the department's legitimacy. Morrison coordinated with several officers who agreed to speak confidentially with internal affairs investigators if inquiries were opened, providing insider perspectives that would be difficult for the department to dismiss as biased complaints from civilians. The fifth component was legal action. Richardson consulted with civil rights attorneys who agreed to file a federal lawsuit on Mayme's behalf, alleging violation of her Fourth Amendment rights against unreasonable search and seizure and her 14th Amendment rights to equal protection under law. The lawsuit was filed on May 10th in U.S. District Court for the Southern District of New York, seeking damages and injunctive relief, requiring the police department to implement reforms to prevent similar misconduct. These components operated simultaneously during May 1966, creating cumulative pressure from multiple directions. The police commissioner's office received the formal complaints, letters from elected officials, newspaper inquiries following the Amsterdam News article, and notification of the federal lawsuit, all within a 10-day period. While the 28th Precinct received visits from Congressman Powell's staff, internal affairs investigators responding to the complaints, and reporters asking about Sullivan's employment status. Captain Walsh, the precinct commander, faced questions from superior officers about why previous complaints against Sullivan had not resulted in disciplinary action. The pressure created a situation where protecting Sullivan became more costly to the department than disciplining him. Dismissing the complaints would require explaining to elected officials, newspaper reporters, and federal judges why documented patterns of misconduct did not warrant action. Defending the federal lawsuit would expose departmental policies and practices to scrutiny that could reveal broader problems. Allowing Sullivan to continue patrol duties in Harlem would risk additional incidents that would generate more negative attention. By late May, the department's position began to shift. Internal Affairs opened a formal investigation into Sullivan's conduct based on the complaints and the supporting documentation. Sullivan was reassigned to desk duty while the investigation proceeded, removing him from patrol work where he could interact with Harlem residents. Captain Walsh issued a memorandum to all officers in the 28th Precinct regarding proper procedures for conducting searches and emphasizing that misconduct would result in disciplinary action. The internal affairs investigation proceeded through June and July. Investigators interviewed witnesses to the April 23rd incident, reviewed Sullivan's history of complaints, and spoke with other officers about Sullivan's reputation and behavior. The investigation confirmed that Sullivan had conducted an inappropriate search of Mayme Johnson and identified a pattern of similar misconduct toward other women. The investigation recommended that Sullivan be terminated from the police department. In August 1966, Sullivan was fired from the New York Police Department for conduct unbecoming an officer. The termination represented a rare outcome, as officers who faced misconduct allegations were typically protected by union contracts and by departmental culture that resisted disciplining colleagues. The fact that Sullivan was actually fired demonstrated that the cumulative pressure from multiple sources had made his continued employment untenable. But Sullivan's termination, while significant, I was only one component of the larger outcome. The federal lawsuit continued even after Sullivan's firing because the lawsuit sought not just individual accountability, but systemic reforms. The police commissioner's office, recognizing that defending the lawsuit through trial would be costly and would expose departmental practices to ongoing scrutiny, entered into settlement negotiations in September 1966. The settlement agreement, finalized in October 1966, included several components. The city paid Mayme Johnson $15,000 in compensation for the violation of her civil rights. The police department agreed to implement new training programs for officers regarding proper search procedures and respectful interactions with civilians. The department agreed to establish a dedicated unit within Internal Affairs to investigate complaints of sexual harassment or inappropriate conduct by officers. The department agreed to require officers who were subjects of substantiated misconduct complaints to undergo counseling and retraining before returning to patrol duties. The department agreed to make public quarterly reports regarding complaint statistics and disciplinary actions taken. These reforms, while not eliminating police misconduct, created mechanisms that made such misconduct more likely to be investigated and punished. The dedicated Internal Affairs unit investigating sexual harassment provided women who were harassed by officers with a specific avenue for complaints that would receive serious attention. Or the training programs established expectations that officers were accountable for how they treated civilians. The public reporting requirements created transparency that made it harder for the department to ignore patterns of abuse. The resolution of the situation also created deterrent effects that extended beyond formal policy changes. Officers throughout the department understood that Sullivan had been fired not because he violated abstract policies, but because he had harassed someone connected to Bumpy Johnson, and that harassment had triggered sustained strategic pressure that the department could not ignore. This created incentive for officers to think carefully before mistreating Harlem residents, recognizing that such mistreatment could trigger responses that would damage careers. The quiet effectiveness of the response. Comprehensive documentation gathered within 1 week. Complaints filed through multiple channels simultaneously, political pressure mobilized through elected officials and community leaders, legal action initiated in federal court, officer fired within 4 months, systemic reforms implemented, financial compensation secured, illustrated the power of strategic coordination over immediate violent reaction. Bumpy never discussed the specific actions he had taken to address Sullivan's misconduct. Harlem residents understood that Sullivan had been fired and that reforms had been implemented, but the detailed investigation, coalition building, and coordinated pressure campaign remained largely invisible except to those directly involved. This quiet effectiveness characterized Bumpy's most successful exercises of power, achieving meaningful outcomes through systematic action while avoiding the theatrical demonstrations that might satisfy emotional needs, but that rarely produced lasting change. The incident and its resolution influenced how Harlem residents viewed both police authority and their own capacity to challenge misconduct. The demonstration that an abusive officer could actually be fired and that the department could be forced to implement reforms created hope that formal complaint mechanisms might actually work if supported by strategic pressure. Women who had been harassed by police officers felt more willing to report such incidents because they had seen that complaints could produce results rather than simply being ignored. And the reforms implemented as part of the settlement created lasting changes in how the police department addressed misconduct. The dedicated Internal Affairs Unit investigating sexual harassment handled hundreds of complaints over subsequent years, and the public reporting requirements made it possible for community organizations and newspapers to track patterns of misconduct and to hold the department accountable for how it responded to complaints. For the broader Harlem community, the incident demonstrated principles about how power operates and how systemic problems require systemic solutions. Sullivan's misconduct represented a pattern of abuse that affected many people, not just one prominent family. The effective response required mobilizing multiple forms of pressure simultaneously: formal complaints, political advocacy, community organizing, legal action, internal departmental pressure, rather than relying on any single avenue. The outcome included both individual accountability for Sullivan and structural reforms that would affect how the department operated going forward. The quiet resolution: officer fired, reforms implemented, compensation secured, community empowered, no violence required, no public spectacle created, illustrated that real power came from understanding systems and applying pressure strategically rather than from dramatic gestures that might generate attention but that rarely produced lasting change. Mayme never spoke publicly about the incident with Sullivan. She continued her community work through St. Martin's Episcopal Church, volunteered with charitable organizations, and maintained the dignity and grace that had characterized her presence in Harlem throughout her marriage to Bumpy. The violation she had experienced on Lenox Avenue on April 23, 1966, had been addressed not through revenge that would have offered temporary satisfaction, but through strategic action that created lasting change benefiting the entire community. For Bumpy, the incident reinforced understanding that had guided his most effective actions throughout decades in Harlem. Violence might provide immediate gratification, but strategic coordination created sustainable outcomes. The temptation to respond to Sullivan's misconduct through direct retaliation had been real, but such retaliation would have accomplished little beyond punishing one officer while leaving intact the systemic conditions that enabled police abuse. The strategic response, documenting misconduct, building coalitions, mobilizing political pressure, initiating legal action, creating internal departmental pressure, had been more difficult and had required more patience, but it had produced Sullivan's firing, systemic reforms, and deterrent effects that would influence police behavior for years to come. The legacy of how the incident was addressed extended beyond the specific reforms implemented in 1966. For decades afterward, Harlem residents remembered the story, sometimes told accurately, sometimes embellished through retelling, of how a police officer had harassed Bumpy Johnson's wife, and how that officer had been fired, and how the police department had been forced to change its policies. The details might vary in different versions of the story, but the essential truth remained. Strategic pressure applied through multiple channels simultaneously could produce outcomes that immediate violence could not achieve, and systemic problems required systemic solutions that addressed root causes rather than symptoms. The principles illustrated by how the situation was addressed: gather comprehensive intelligence before acting, understand the system that enables individual misconduct, build coalitions across different sectors, apply pressure through multiple channels simultaneously, pursue both individual accountability and structural reform, maintain sustained effort over weeks and months. While measure success by lasting change rather than dramatic gestures, represented wisdom earned through decades of navigating power dynamics in environments where formal authority often oppressed marginalized communities. Bumpy died less than 2 years after the incident, on July 7, 1968, of a heart attack while eating breakfast at Wells Restaurant in Harlem. Mayme lived for another 41 years until May 2009, and spent her later years working on the biography of her husband that would provide one of the most comprehensive accounts of his life. The incident with Sullivan was one of countless examples of how Bumpy had addressed problems affecting Harlem, most of which were never publicly discussed, but which collectively demonstrated that his authority derived not from capacity for violence, but from capacity for strategic thinking and coordinated action. The quiet power of the resolution, documented, strategic, effective, lasting, stood in contrast to the dramatic narratives that often characterized stories about criminal figures. There were no train tracks involved, no theatrical displays of revenge, no spectacles designed to generate fear or admiration. There was only systematic investigation, coalition building, strategic pressure, and sustained effort that produced an officer's termination, departmental reforms, legal remedies, and lasting deterrent effects. This was the reality of how power operated when wielded by people who understood that systems required